And oh, sorry. Okay. Sorry, I just gave me the notification. My name is Meagan Fitzpatrick, and I'm an associate professor at the University of Maryland School of Medicine, which is in Baltimore, Maryland, in the US. My expertise is in infectious disease modeling, and particularly with an eye on analyzing vaccine impact and value for money, often expressed as cost effectiveness. So I do a little bit of mathematical modeling for disease transmission and disease dynamics, and I do a little bit of modeling for health economics and intervention impact. Um, and I did my PhD at Yale with the Center for Infectious Disease Modeling and Analysis. I still collaborate with them quite frequently. Um, and I've been at Maryland now for, oh my goodness, I'm going to date myself, I guess, uh, 8 years or so. So, um, I'm delighted to meet you. I'm here in Kampala, um, still in my role as faculty at the University of Maryland. I'm working remotely for these 2 years. Well, my husband has a temporary position working for the US Embassy here. So I'm physically here in Kampala for 2 years, and I'm delighted to meet you all. I was thrilled to see that you have an infectious disease modeling unit here, and I'm very grateful to Abel for the invitation to speak with you. Um, so I will share my screen and give a presentation. Um, so let's see if I can manage this. So I have here, let me try another way. Okay, so you all can see my screen, yes?
Yes, we can see the screen.
Okay, excellent. So I'm going to give you a bit of an overview of one of the topics that I have done probably the most modeling on, at least the most before COVID. So I did do a lot of outbreak response and analytics during COVID-19. Abel specifically asked me um, to present a project to you today that had a number of sensitivity analyses and a number of different approaches. And so the projects that I did on rabies really ran the spectrum on types of modeling, sensitivity analyses, data inputs, regions of the world that were working on it, and perspectives. And so I thought it might give you an overview of the kind of things that that I could assist with or be useful to you, or even just hopefully be interesting. Um, so at any point throughout the presentation, please feel free to pause and ask a question. I might not be able to see a hand if it's raised, so you can also feel free to just unmute yourself and say, "Excuse me, I have a question about this," or "Could you slow down? I don't understand something," or "Could you go back to another slide?" I'm very happy to take questions throughout the presentation and in the middle of the talk, if you have any. So the focus, as I said, is building the One Health case for rabies control. And I'm sure that because you're all working with Able, and I happen to know, I'm going to briefly introduce, but very briefly, One Health and then the rabies burden globally. And I'll give you three case studies I worked on, one from Tanzania, one from Ethiopia, and one from India. And so One Health is this idea that the health of people is connected to that of animals in the shared environment. And so in this case with rabies, I think that's fairly obvious why, right? People get rabies from animals, mostly from domestic dogs. Um, and and so the health of the animals has a direct influence on the health of humans. And so here are different kinds of, you could say, stages of relationship for the One Health disease. Stage 5 is the one that mostly preoccupies people, I think, which are those with exclusive human-to-human transmission. But then we are dealing over here with stage 1, which is that the agent is in animals, or I suppose it's like stage 2, which is that rabies directly impacts humans through infection, but there's no human-to-human transmission. All of the rabies comes from animals to humans, which is important as we begin to consider control strategies. And so here's a slightly older map I probably should have updated, but of the global burden of rabies, with darker red indicating more intense rabies transmission and a higher burden in those places. And so we can see that that although much of North America and Europe have eliminated canine rabies and have eliminated rabies in humans, that much of sub-Saharan Africa is still struggling with rabies control. So as I mentioned, the primary route of human exposure is from rabid dogs. Over 95% of all human exposures globally are from rabid dogs. There are occasionally other hosts, foxes or raccoons or things like that, but most humans are at risk from the animals that live most closely with us. And so even though rabies has been eliminated in North America and the UK, we ask, why not Africa? What are some barriers? And so a review identified a number of barriers in 2010. And so some of these have been addressed, some of which I'm proud to say have been addressed in part by the work you're about to see here and by the evidence that we generated in Tanzania and Ethiopia. And so, but the operational constraints, the reasons why the sub-Saharan Africa was struggling to control rabies was that it was often given low priority. So these direct human-to-human health concerns are often prioritized ahead of rabies. Also, operational constraints, which I think is illustrated very well by this photo that I took in Tanzania. As I'm sure many of you well know, access to the remote areas where rabies remains most endemic is often difficult. There's also substantial uncertainty about the epidemiology. In this case, one driving question of the research I'm about to show you was, could you even control rabies strictly through canine vaccination? Or did you need to also vaccinate wildlife in some of these ecosystems, which border those we see in Uganda, here in Tanzania, specifically Serengeti and Ngorongoro? And then also limited resources, which is just a difficult situation. So the case study from Tanzania. So I'm sure most of you are familiar with the R0, which is the reproductive number. But if you'd like me to spend more time on this, then I will. But it basically indicates the average number of secondary infections that arise from one infected case. And so in the mathematical modeling, we often express it as the product of the probability of infection given contact between a susceptible and an infected individual. The contact rate, so the contact rate, particularly between susceptible and infectious individuals, as well as the duration of infectiousness, right? So the duration of infectiousness is important because if you are, for instance, if you're facing a lifelong disease such as HIV, then the probability of infection given contact can actually be quite low, but the R0 is driven up by the fact that the infection is lifelong. And so you can achieve control when you're able to get your population metrics, your over 1 minus 1, when an intervention is able to reduce the risk of disease to a level equal or greater to 1 minus 1 over R0. So as I mentioned before, the ecological context for this work I'm about to show you is in Serengeti National Park. Is actually not in the park and in the conservation area, but in the communities which border Serengeti National Park and which border Ngorongoro Conservation Area. And the problem here is that in this, particularly in this area by the national parks, um, there are, or in and around them, there are numerous canine hosts or other mammalian hosts which are capable of carrying rabies as competently as the domestic dog. And so there would be observations, for instance, um, that African wild dogs, which are a distinct species from the domestic dog, could be carrying rabies. Or in some cases, the jackals could be carrying rabies or hyenas. And so there was a question mark about whether it would be enough to vaccinate just the domestic dogs, or whether you needed to be concerned with other, particularly canid mammalian species in these conservation areas. And of course, as you might imagine, and as you might be familiar from the Uganda national parks, if you wanted to do an intervention in the conservation areas, it would be a pretty high, it could be difficult. So the multiple host problem at hand is that, as I showed you before, the calculations of required vaccination coverage that I traditionally consider what you need to apply to a whole system. However, in this case, the domestic dogs are the only ones who are going to receive the vaccine. And so how do we estimate the required coverage? And so in this case, we used an approach that is not necessarily a full-on transmission model, but instead we incorporated something called the host type matrix. And so host type 1 being domestic dogs and host type 2 being wild carnivores, you can, any given K value would be the number of cases in A, which are the result of a single case in B. And so if you're asking, how many cases in domestic dogs are the result of a single case in domestic dog, you can think of these as sort of like mini R naughts, specifically expressing that of the of these host type relationships between 1 and 1 or 1 and 2, 2 and 1 or 2 and 2. And if you structure them as a matrix and you take the eigenvalue of the matrix, then the eigenvalue of the matrix actually gives you the reproductive number of the system. And if what you're interested in doing, so if you're interested in trying to figure out the type reproductive number for for establishing the canine vaccination, or sorry, the vaccination coverage required specifically in domestic dogs, then you can basically calculate what we call the type reproductive number, which is T1 here, expressed as this equation here, which is a rearrangement of the matrix and the eigenvalue calculation, and substitute that type reproductive number in the more traditional equation for R naught. And this was not a mathematical formula that I established. It comes from Robertson Heisterbeek. And so the data that we needed as inputs for this were specifically what these K values could be. And so so my collaborators who were operating, as I mentioned, in the communities near the Serengeti National Park and just outside the Ngorongoro Conservation Area, they did contact tracing to identify rabies events and recorded 3,000 potential transmission events between 2002 and 2006 and reconstructed case histories for over 1,000 suspect rabid animals. So here you can see a map of where the cases occurred, and you can see the time series here of the cases as well. And then they reconstructed actually like a series of reconstructed case histories, allowing for some uncertainty about unobserved links between cases. And we put those into our equation to give us some answers. So here is annual vaccination target on the x-axis. So if you were to achieve one of these vaccination targets as a proportion of total domestic dogs, what would be your confidence in successful control of rabies. And so the confidence level, it comes from the full spectrum of uncertainty from the recreated transmission trees. And we compared it specifically to the World Health Organization target of 70% coverage for a regular context in which you were not considering alternative hosts. So in this case, in Ngorongoro in green and in Serengeti in purple, you can be more than 95% confident. That's what this line here indicates, 95% confidence in control. And at 70% vaccination in both districts, you can be more than 95% confident that you would be able to achieve control simply through vaccinating domestic dogs alone. I'm going to pause now. Are there any questions on this first set of results or on this first project and approach? Okay. So our next question was, that's all well and good that you could achieve control, but what is it going to cost? And so here you can see some of the rabies vaccination campaigns that were operating in Tanzania. And so these are mobile trucks that go and people bring their dogs. And it's a relatively inexpensive program, but the question is both, what will it cost as a full part of the budget to do this throughout all of the communities in these areas where rabies is endemic? And specifically, what's your value for money in terms of cost effectiveness? So we put together a transmission model. This might look a little more familiar to you, with basically an SER type model on the rabies side. Sorry, I say SER, but it's actually SEI. So all animals which experience rabies die. They do not recover, actually. So any animal who actually begins to show symptoms of rabies and to be infectious never reaches a recovered state. And so we see that as well. Here's our wildlife. So we stratified by the wildlife hosts and the domestic dog hosts. And in this case, we also have dogs who are susceptible, exposed, rabid, or infectious. And then also dogs that can be moved to the vaccinated compartment, which is a protected or a recovered compartment. And so in this case, all of the human outcomes then exist strictly as outcomes of the number of rabid dogs. If you remember, although it is possible for rabid wildlife to attack and confer rabies to humans, it is a rare event, and the bulk of human rabies comes directly from rabid dogs. And so the first question, so we use the transmission model along with the parameterization that we previously described and model the range of coverage levels from 0 to 95% coverage was actually our cutoff. And estimated the cost per square kilometer, which was our way of thinking about sort of like how many villages or what area in the villages could be covered. And so the cost per square kilometer is given here. And even though the cost per square kilometer is quite high, right? So to say that you have to spend, the first thing to notice is that the cost per square kilometer is quite high at 0 coverage. And that's because in a situation in which there's just PEP alone, in which people have to be treated for the bites of a rabid dog, that cost is exceedingly high for those treatments on an annual basis. And then as you begin to vaccinate dogs, the cost of PEP drops substantially. And once you begin a program that has even 5% coverage here, you can see that there's big initial bulk startup costs, and then additional costs of vaccinating progressively more animals. But if you remember from those mobile units, the big first cost is getting there in the first place. Um, and then the um, and then the next set of costs here is raising at the end, sorry, you could see that the costs accelerate at the end. We assumed that it became increasingly more difficult to get animals vaccinated above about 85% in Ngorongoro, which was what was demonstrated to be achieved by the mobile clinics, and then above approximately 75% in Serengeti, again, which was shown as what could be achieved by the mobile clinics. But the really important thing is if you focus on the solid line, you see that compared to the do nothing option in Serengeti, you actually are saving money by doing canine vaccination. In Ngorongoro, you're not saving money compared to do nothing, but it's a fairly inexpensive proposition. And specifically, oh, sorry, I didn't show my acceptability curves, but it is cost effective. So I'm sorry, I can't see the chat. I'm getting a chat bubble that says that people have put
Yeah,
things in this.
yeah,
Could
no, maybe,
somebody
yeah, maybe
ask their questions out loud?
you pro
Or
do you want me to read them now? Because I think it would be nice for you to respond to them now, or we could come to them.
I can read them now. Or you can read, yeah,
Yeah,
or
let me read
either
them.
you
Let me
can
read
read
them.
or the students themselves can ask. Yeah.
Okay. Shakira, do you want to go? Do you want to go first, and then Letitia? Shakira, are you able to speak? Oh no. Some of them had joined with a louder voice, so I had unmuted them. But let me just read. Let me read. Um, let me see if I have, let me try to enable that icon for participants to. Shakira, can you unmute now?
All right. Thank you so much, Abel. Thank you so much, Megan. This is really interesting. My very first question was how best we can have access to like this code for the first results that you presented, but also for this cost effectiveness analysis. I think it would be nice for some of us as we would just try to mimic and tailor it to some of our work, but also for learning purposes to see how you're able to do these things. And then regarding the current slide that is being projected, so you spoke about initially the cost was quite high and this was tailored to PEP, but after some time there was a reduction in cost, which is was attributed to the fact that now you had started vaccinating quite a number of dogs, and as such, they were not infecting many people that rather required PEP. But then we see an increase in cost after some time, which I don't think I have been able to capture so well in terms of explanation. But maybe just to recap, you said probably this could be because of a distance. And so most of the cost now gets down to distance, trying to locate the animals to vaccinate. And my question was, are we then saying that PEP is less costly? I mean, is more costly compared to the vaccine? Thank you.
Okay, yeah, let me explain this a little bit better. So this is not over time. This is over increased coverage. So what I did is I ran the model I simulated what would happen if you had coverage at these different levels. And so specifically, if you had 60% coverage, how much are you spending on PEP, which is the big dashed line? How much would you be spending on vaccination, which is the short dashed line? And then what is the total, which is just the sum of the two? And so if you ran a program, if you ran a program where you had no vaccination, no canine vaccination at all, you expect to be spending quite a bit of money on post-exposure prophylaxis, on PEP, right? And as you begin to vaccinate, So let's say that you vaccinate 40% of the dogs, you achieve substantial savings in post-exposure prophylaxis, right? From here to here. And you do have to spend money on the vaccination program, which is the difference between essentially 0 and here. But your total cost, I'm terribly sorry, my mouse is oversensitive. The total cost, which is here, is lower than the total cost when you were just paying for PEP alone. You see? And that remains true if this is your starting point with post-exposure prophylaxis. That remains true until you are able to achieve quite high coverage. What I meant here is that if you just run the mobile clinics, which is what they saw in Serengeti, they were able to get about 70% coverage just through the mobile clinics where the truck goes to a central point and people bring their dogs. And then in Serengeti, they found that they had, in order to get to approximately 90% coverage, they had to run house-to-house clinics, which were much more expensive. So they had to go back to the villages and try to find the people who owned dogs who had not come to the first clinic. And so that was much more expensive here. And so you see that that they were able to get there, but the cost per dog was much higher. So the cost of getting to that coverage was higher. And then above this, we basically projected, okay, what if they had to go back one more time? What does that, what does that look like to try to get an additional, say, 10% of dogs? But the basic structure of this is that as coverage increases, there is sort of like a lowest value here for the most cost-saving intervention, which is approximately 20%. But when you're running the mobile clinic, by just sticking around, you're able to get 70%, and that is in itself cost-saving compared to post-exposure prophylaxis alone. In Ngorongoro, they were not able to get as much in the way of basically the mobile clinics. The communities were further spread out and they were nomadic. So they basically did house to house more or less straight up from the beginning. So does that explain, is that clear that this is not over
Yes.
time? Okay.
Yes, it's very clear. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Yeah, let's have another one, Megan, and that is Letitia.
Yes. So mine was about the reproductive number, the R naught that you had explained previously. And then sometimes you have a very big system of equations, and it's really hard to come up with the R naught. I don't know if you would provide us later on with some materials or just guidance on how you can come up with an R naught for such big systems in an easier way.
Yeah, in this case, this system was actually very simple. As you could see, the R naught equation was just one line, and it included the eigenvalue of a matrix and was very straightforward. So this would not be a great example of how to get R naught out of a complicated system. And I think I would say that I can try to look for some resources, but I may not be extremely helpful. I often don't. I think R naught is often useful to calculate from perhaps from the data directly. But then I'm not sure that I have a really excellent method that I think is particularly useful for estimating R naught from your system of equations. If that makes sense. But I know that there are methods, I just am not super familiar with it, and it's not something I usually attempt. So, or mostly because I don't find it, well, it can be helpful, but it isn't always as helpful as people think in complicated systems, is I suppose where I'll leave that. Are there any more questions about about this? Okay. So the second case study was from Ethiopia, And so in this case, the ecological context here is that there were three areas in which a team from Ethiopia was working. And so this was led by my colleague Tariku. It was his doctoral work. And he was looking very specifically at a comparison of rabies in these three districts of Ethiopia. And so Bishoftu is urban, very close to Addis Ababa. Lamuna Bilbilo, which we'll focus on today, is rural and has mixed crops and livestock. And then Yabelo is rural lowlands and pastoral. And so he was doing a lot of work characterizing the impact of rabies and the cost effectiveness of canine rabies control, or really the state of canine rabies programs in these three areas. But today we'll talk just about one for speed. The shocking thing about Lamuna Bilbilo was that the rabies incidence was 21% at the herd level. And so that doesn't mean that 21% of all animals had rabies, which I suppose might be what this figure implies, but that 21% of herds would experience at least one rabies event. And every herd level event cost approximately $228 in US dollars, which is shocking, particularly when you compare it to the per capita GDP in Ethiopia at the time, which was $767. So as you can see, if you're unlucky enough to have rabies hit your herd, it can be disastrous for a family's income. And so we basically constructed a model using local data and constructed a model very similar to the one that I just showed you in Tanzania, except that instead of human outcomes, we had livestock outcomes. And so here for the state of Lamuna Bilbilo, we found that that coverage with annual campaigns. So this is the same figure that I showed you before. That as the coverage with annual vaccination campaigns increased, the total cost here in blue dropped dramatically. And that was largely due to the economic loss due to cattle rabies. We did include the human component, which is post-exposure treatment. And so you can see there in red, but you can't see it very well because it's really the economic losses from cattle rabies just absolutely dwarfed all other economic considerations in this case. And so the point being here that it was exceedingly worthwhile to mount a canine vaccination program, even if you're just considering the health of the animal population in the area. And then the third case study here is from India. And in this case, the state, are there any questions on the Ethiopian case study? I know that it was quite short, but I took out a bunch of slides for time. Okay. So the third case study is in India. And so we were approached by the Public Health Foundation of India because they were focusing on canine rabies control as part of their One Health Committee. So the One Health Committee was established in 2009 in Tamil Nadu. And the first step, which was extremely successful, was to streamline human PEP. And so they were able to get really high coverage with PEP in their local clinics throughout Tamil Nadu. But then they realized that this was expensive, and so they turned their attention to canine rabies control. And initially, their focus was on the elimination and control of stray dogs, which are 42% of the canine population in Tamil Nadu. And so we created a transmission model that separated stray dogs and own dogs here. So the O description is for own dogs, and S designation is for stray dogs. And I realize that this is a little bit sideways, but we start with susceptible, and they could move to exposed. hold on. I'm trying to backtrack here. Sorry, we start with susceptible here. Susceptible owned dogs and susceptible stray dogs here. If they could be vaccinated, and then they would move to a class that was protected from rabies. But then the second intervention that was being considered alongside vaccination was also sterilization. And so here we have female sterilization and male sterilization, particularly of the stray dogs. So once again, the interventions that were being considered were canine vaccination alone, or once you've captured the dog, vaccination and sterilization of potentially just females, which is both more complicated but considered to be higher impact for population control, or female and male dogs. And then in this case, we consider that the vaccine could also have a possibility of waning. So this is the X class. So they used to be vaccinated, but instead the vaccine has waned. And then dogs who are either susceptible or have a vaccine which has waned or expired move to the exposed class and then to infectious. And infectious dogs can infect owned or susceptible dogs at various rates, and also can infect humans and move humans to the exposed class and then ultimately to either receipt of post-exposure prophylaxis or to death. So we also modeled the potential for owned dogs to transition to stray, which is also a common problem. And the data inputs here were taken from a variety of sources in Tamil Nadu. So there was a canine census. Also, we had, it says rabies history from Tanzania. The word that's missing is natural history. Things like the duration of infectiousness once a dog transitions to the infectious state, which we considered not to vary between contexts. Stray dog demography from Jaipur, which is another state in India. Things like the lifespan of your stray dog, or the male-female ratio. And then we also used 2005 human autopsy data and 2014 human surveillance data on human deaths. And so what you can see here is that this is the distribution of human rabies deaths from the 2005 human autopsy data. And we put all of these together using the model. And actually, even though I was just telling you that I rarely find it useful to report on the R0, it is straightforward to calculate from the system, from a system that is simple like this one. And in that case, we were able to demonstrate that even though many of these parameters had quite large distributions, right? So the human rabies death parameter in itself is given here as an example, right? The potential distribution on that ranged from 0 to 1,000 human rabies deaths having occurred in that year. And when you put them all together in the system itself establishes the relationships and constrains them nicely, so that the R0 that was selected through an MCMC process established the posterior distribution as 1.38 to 1.46, which is quite a tight range for the R0. I apologize now for the sudden change in slides. I dropped in a bunch of extra slides that I wanted to show you, but I recognize that the formatting is a dramatic shift, so I didn't have time to update them before the meeting. So this is the output. Here we can see that over time, in the years since implementation of the program in Tamil Nadu, this is our expectation for the number of human deaths. And this is their expectation for the number of bite victims. And the colors indicate all of the different programs. Status quo is here in gray, so we would sort of assume that that on average, there aren't confidence intervals around these just because of the number of strategies that are being displayed, but that, on average, you would, if you did nothing, you would get no effect. That's the gray line. And then this is canine vaccination rather than rather than reported here as coverage, it's reported here as the target number of dogs that needed to be vaccinated, among the stray population by teams of veterinary workers. So if you had an annual target of 100,000, it's that lightest blue line, moving to the darkest blue line for 500,000 as an annual target, so 5 times as many dogs. And what you would also see is the other alternative is canine vaccination and sterilization. So the orange lines indicate the impact of canine vaccination and sterilization all the way from the light to the dark. And so what you see here is that you can get pretty remarkable control, even just by capturing 100,000 dogs and either vaccinating or sterilizing, and you get a little bit more benefit from sterilization at this light color. But you get obviously greater control and faster control if you go for larger targets. What we also wanted to point out is that if the number of bite victims does not dramatically change, and this is because the recommendation for PEP given a dog bite would still be there. We're not suggesting that PEP go away. And there are, in fact, so many dogs, such a high density of dogs in Tamil Nadu, that the bite victims, the majority of the bites do come from dogs which are not rabid. This is a marked change from the ecosystem in the Tanzania context, which was the first one, in which most dogs were not aggressive. There was a pretty large emphasis on obedience among dogs, and also there were very few strays. And so because there were also very few strays, most of the time the dog bites were from a dog that was known and owned, and so it was not the same dynamic as here in Tamil Nadu. So here, even though we see that a fairly modest program of about 100,000 dogs a year as a target for the veterinary workers gives you some gains, and you get more as you get bigger. So then we plotted this on the cost effectiveness plane. And what this tells us is the cumulative disability adjusted life years averted on the x-axis, the cumulative cost of the strategy in millions of USD. And this tells us which strategies are most efficient. So which strategy, by sketching out this line, we say, what are the strategies that don't have a better option? An option that so for instance, for this one, you cannot get this number of DALIs at this cost any other way. But you wouldn't move to this one because you wouldn't move to this option because there is a lower cost strategy that provides more protection, more health benefits in terms of disability adjusted life years averted. So these strategies are here excluded. And similarly, you can see that they remain excluded on the plane. And so pointing out just a couple of things. So this cost effectiveness plane is very nice, but look how close the overlap is, particularly for canine vaccination and female sterilization. So what if you only perform sterilization on the female dogs as they came your way? That the intervention begins to overlap. And so even though at the point estimate, for the point estimate, we can see that there's sort of like there should be a clear preference for canine vaccination. It's also, I think, clear that when you begin to add uncertainty, the answer is less straightforward and less clear, that these could be pretty viable programs of canine vaccination and female sterilization at very similar targets, if not, in fact, slightly lower targets, to achieve the same level of control. And so what we have here is we call this a cost effectiveness acceptability curve. And so given a particular cost effectiveness threshold or a willingness to pay for a particular willingness to pay to avert one disability adjusted life year, what is the probability that your strategy is optimal? And sorry, I realized I cut off the top of this here. So this is based on 1 and 3 times the per capita GDP, which has since fallen out of use by WHO, but was for a while the WHO recommended standard for cost effectiveness of a program. And at those values, you could see that canine vaccination alone, with targets of 100,000 and 200,000, were the clear winner. But if you, in fact, were willing to pay a little bit, willing to pay more money for your disability adjusted life year averted, you would get into spaces with both higher targets or ultimately where canine vaccination and female sterilization at 100,000, where canine vaccination and female sterilization might be the correct choice. And even here, there's about a 20 to 25% probability that you should do female sterilization. So this is where we started to ask, okay, what is it that these models are sensitive to? What pushes us into one space or the other? And so we took a look at the operational parameters that were at work here. And so specifically, we wanted to ask, are there operational parameters, sort of like things that might emerge as the programs get going, that might make you choose one program or another? And so what we found is that so what we have here is that the color is the same color, but it's also labeled here. So canine vaccination 200,000 K is the same color in all of these boxes. In that across a variation in the price of the canine vaccine from our modeled assumption of about 52 cents USD through to higher levels, that in fact the program you would choose remains the same. But if you had even just a little bit of variation in the number of dogs who could be sterilized by the veterinary team per day, you would move into a space where canine vaccination and female sterilization was your preferred choice. Now, this was really illuminating in part because it was kind of a guess, not on our part, but by the experts we were working with about exactly how many dogs could be sterilized per vet team per day. And so if you could review the operations of those teams and get a little bit of efficiency, and if they could capture and vaccinate 7 dogs instead of 6, then you would also want a program of canine vaccination and female sterilization, which notably, it would also be much more popular and perhaps opened up other avenues of funding for the program. Access to post-exposure prophylaxis, as I mentioned, it was quite high in Tamil Nadu. And here we're not advocating that PEP coverage should drop, but we were saying if there was another context in India with similar dog demography, but with less of a commitment to post-exposure prophylaxis, you see that the canine vaccination targets increase. So for instance, if you thought that only 50% of rabid bite victims were able to access PEP, you would go for larger canine vaccination programs in compensation. But then some of the other questions at hand were sort of like, what if, not just the immunoglobulin, but what about the availability of the intradermal vaccine and how that affects the cost and also the effectiveness of the program. The model was pretty insensitive. The number of targets didn't really matter. Or if you were uncertain about the disability adjusted life years that were incurred per dog bite, again, the model is fairly insensitive to that. And so a summary of these 3 case studies at once. Investment in canine rabies vaccination is often justified, both epidemiologically and economically, but a One Health perspective is essential. And sensitivity analyses can often assist decision makers in planning their programs. I want to acknowledge the many collaborators across these 3 studies, particularly my collaborators at Yale and Wageningen University, also Serengeti Health Initiative and the Public Health Foundation of India, UT Austin, London, and then, of course, my funders. So are there any questions?
Yes, Megan, thank you so much for the great talk. It's exciting to see how grounded you are with One Health. Yeah, let's see if we have any questions from the members. Anyone?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I can open the chat now, but so it sounds like Benjamin, did you have a question?
No, he left. He left.
Oh, okay.
Briefly, Megan, as members are okay. Gerard, go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much. I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
Yes.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Megan, for the presentation. Thank you very much, Abel, for coordinating it. Just a quick one. I was looking at this might be off the presentation, but was there something interesting with the distribution of the measles cases as you were looking through it? I'm sorry why I bring this up is I was caught by the images you are using on your slides, and I noticed most of um, the dogs were seem to have been brought in by children, and of course from I want to experience, but I don't think that's the best way to present it. But most dogs tend to be around children, so I'm not sure if there was you were able to pick that out as well from the investigation, from your studies. And then the other thing was about I was trying to understand the rationale for the sterilization, because I was looking at the flow where you have the dogs that get rabid. Of course, the outcome usually death. What is the timeline between infection and the point at which the dog will die? Because if you're looking at sterilization, then you're trying to prevent reproduction, and then of course increase the population of susceptible hosts for the rabies virus. So if you look at the timeline between infection and death, the outcome in a rabid dog versus the time at which a dog reproduces up to the point at which it is able to actually contract the virus and then also be a host. I'm trying to understand this.
Okay, hold on.
rationale
Yeah, let
behind this.
me answer your first question first, which is to say, yes, we did use the age distribution of rabies cases for Tanzania. Yes, we used and that played a part when calculating the disability adjusted life years. So, using that age distribution, we calculated sort of like how many life years on average would be lost from a rabies case in humans. So that is how the age distribution was taken into consideration. For your second question, I'm not sure I totally understand it. Let me answer what I think your question is, but you can tell me if that's wrong. So yes, we did there we go. So we did model the population dynamics, the birth and the death of the dogs. And if what you're asking is why vaccinate the strays or why sterilize the strays, so it is true and expected. And the understanding of dog population demography in India, in consultation with people who were working in animal welfare in India, is that, as you kill more dogs, you actually create an ecological opening for more dogs to be born. So, right, so that if there's only so many dogs that the population will support. Even these stray dogs are sort of nominally supported by individuals. So even though they're not owned, they're often, considered to be guard dogs outside of a building or that kind of thing. And they're both protected and fed by somebody often. And so the idea for the sterilization is that you are slowing down, yes, the reproduction of the stray population and the turnover in the dog population. So that's how it was modeled. We included basically a function for the birth rate that was conditional on the sort of like the carrying capacity of the population. Does that make sense?
I think on one end, it half answers the question. The other half probably is I was just trying to look at the I'm looking at the timeline from the time, I mean the stretch from the time a dog is infected to the time it actually does die. And then when you compare
Oh,
it
that's
to
quite short between when a
Yeah.
dog is infected and when it does die. So this here, E to I. So from this is approximately 1 month, right? And so it is possible that a dog could be exposed and could be a carrier of rabies, but not yet infectious, and that it's possible that the rabies vaccine given in that window could, if they happen to be selected for sterilization or vaccination, it's entirely possible that that could itself prevent their rabies from turning into full-blown infectious rabies, but we don't know that, and so we just modeled it as once they were in the E class, they had to go, that they would transition to I. Does that make sense?
Yes, that actually does explain it.
Okay.
No, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Megan. I know you have to run.
I do. I'm sorry.
We will have you next week again. We could continue talking to you later and ask any questions next week.
Okay, thank you very much. It was very nice to be able to present, and thank you all for your engagement and your questions.
Yeah, great talk, and thank you so much for teaching us about your amazing work.
Thank you. Have a good afternoon, day, everyone. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.